All right, so
That's good.
we've gone ahead and started recording. So eventually we're going to record intros and outros and so on, but we need to know what the name of the podcast is to do that, and we don't actually know that yet. So right now, I'm Mary Anne and Mohanraj. This is Kel Bachus, and we are very old friends, writers, artists, ADD. We do too many things, and today we were going to have a conversation about I don't know, branding, I guess, I think is maybe what
Sure.
it is, or yeah, pulling together some kind of like small business identity for
Yeah.
yourself and your work. So Kel, do you want to start talking about Fiberworld and kind of what led you to it?
Yeah. So I'm working on Fiberworld right now, which Mary Anne knows. You're one of the hosts, which is very exciting to me for a whole bunch of reasons. Yeah. So back in ages ago, in fact, I was just looking at Facebook, and there's a your memories post, and it's our little booth 7 years ago at a farmer's market. And I remember being so excited when we sold like $100 worth of yarn at a farmer's market. That's how small we were. And now we're, big. Yeah, and at that time it was kind of, I think it was like a play business. You don't ever believe that it's going to go anywhere, or if you do, you think it's going to be a fluke or whatever. And of course, now that I've started and run a few businesses, I realize no, there's this sort of an intentional process. Like you have some control over that. And so, and at some level, sometimes you don't either.
Well, and I think there's sort of an interesting moment there in transitioning to really taking your work seriously as a business.
Yes.
And I kind of feel like I didn't do that till last year, even though I've been a writer for 25 plus years. I've been filing as a writer with the IRS, doing my Schedule C, showing a little profit some years, showing a loss other years.
Yeah.
So I've been kind of like going through the motions in that sense,
Mm-hmm.
but I never like sat down and made a business plan, right? It was just like, let me
Right.
write stories and see if someone will publish them, right? And it
Yeah.
was only last year when I had to make a decision about indie publishing a book or not and investing in a print run that
Right.
it all became very real. And it was like, oh, I have to decide whether to bet 20 to 30 to $40,000 on a project, right? And
Yeah.
like that makes it a business.
Yeah.
So
But I mean, but by the same token, it's like, you've always been a business. It's been like amusing, ranging to sort of not annoying, but sort of like disgruntling to me to watch you do so many highly professional, amazing things, but particularly within the art sphere, certainly the editorial sphere, and and feel like you're kind of not taking yourself seriously. And I think, there's lots of perfectly good reasons for that. That's not your fault. And I feel some of it's, obviously the questions of gender that we've been talking about throughout, as a sort of, well, if I do a thing, I don't take it very seriously, and I don't consider myself an expert. But there's a whole raft of people in the world who are like, you do something once and you're the be all end all, and I think in business that's really important.
yeah, there's
And
a so
yeah,
there's a line, right? God give me the confidence of a mediocre white man, right? And
yes, yeah, yeah,
it does like resonate with me at times. I do think like it's partly the gender stuff. I agree
mhm,
that that's part of it, and very much internalized in the sense of I remember when I was sometime in my 30s, I had this realization that even though I went to college, I expected to support myself.
mhm,
Um, I never expected that I would be supporting a family, right? I thought
mhm, mhm.
I might have a partner, I might have kids, but I never thought like I need a career that would let me support a family. And I think that is probably pretty common for women in America at any rate. And um, probably a lot of men get a different message. I think it came home to me when I was in the Chicago South Asian arts and activism scene
Mhm.
was almost entirely women. And
Mm.
it made it really obvious, like, Oh, all of the kids, the sons of first generation immigrants, right, or of immigrants, the first generation sons, had all gotten the message very clearly that they had to be lawyers, doctors, accountants, engineers, and be able
Right.
to support a family. And only the women had the leeway to take these low paying jobs in activism in the arts, to even
Yeah.
have
That's
take that
actually,
seriously, right?
I mean, I think that's a really good point. I think that's a really good point. And at some levels, it's a boon because then you're able to engage in that. But then on the other hand, it's sort of like, well, but it's not a real job, and then it still carries that stigma. So it's like, double-edged sword. That's an interesting observation.
And then I'll add in that I think the science fiction stuff plays into it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, sorry, that the science fiction stuff plays into it, as well as maybe the mainstream literary art scene too, a little bit, in that science fiction has this long tradition of doing things for the love, right?
Mhm.
There's this
Yes.
massive fandom tradition. And so even though there is commercial, professional science fiction, lots of those people were also fans and would pour time and energy into running conventions or doing
Yep.
fanzines and that kind of thing. So when we started Strange Horizons, for example, even though we came into it saying we're going to be super professional about paying writers pro rates, we're going to do an online magazine, which was new, but we're going to make it look sharp, and we'll publish on time every week and have the highest literary standards, etc. Right? Like, so we're going to do all that professionally, but we're not going to pay ourselves because, like, we're the volunteer editorial staff doing this for the love, right? And so that
Right.
that tradition, and I think there is some of that in mainstream literary arts as well, which is often not a well-paying field. It's
Mm-hmm.
probably very different from maybe people who are working in TV and film, for example, where there's
Yeah.
more money and it's more plausible that you might make a living
Right.
at it.
Right. Well,
So,
I mean, and it's funny too, because, I think about like the dichotomy between what you're talking about and then like the video game world. And of course, in the video game industry, artists come out of, Champlain's program and expect to make a high salary right away, if they're any
mm,
good,
yeah,
um, and that, and that, for me, it was sort of like, well, if you're going to choose art as a career, you need a backup plan, that it's like, that's if you were an artist or a writer or, a musician or whatever, there was always the backup plan is sort of like, well, unless you're a prodigy or, amazing or whatever, then you're not really guaranteed much of anything. And you think about too, like up until like the last decade, like even science fiction books, fantasy books, I mean, literally Pulp Fiction, the paper it was printed on was subpar, it was sort of this whole, yeah, I mean, it was this
yeah.
whole kind of like, and along with that came the lack of literary recognition, when in fact we know that these works are fantastic. And
I'd
um,
also say, one way this has improved immensely that is probably not visible to everybody is that, we talk about the golden age of science fiction when writers could make, a good living selling short stories to magazines. But
right,
that's like 10 writers, maybe
right,
30, right? Like, it's very few people who could do that. And they were
yes,
almost all white men, I think, at the time.
and
And
they all knew each other.
they all knew each other. I mean, in part they knew each other because they went to conventions and they like did fanish stuff together. But they and if anyone's listening and is interested in this, I really strongly recommend Samuel Delaney's memoir, The Motion of Light and Water, because he talks about sort of being a brilliant young gay Black man writing science fiction, and coming into this world while also navigating a complicated New York City love life. And it's just great. It's a beautiful book, by one of our best writers. So I guess, what I'm seeing now is that there are a lot more people. We've had this massive democratizing internet indie publishing effect, right?
Right.
Where on the one hand, there maybe aren't as many magazines paying enough for short fiction sales for you to make a living, but there are a lot of people selling direct on Amazon, making a living that way, going,
Yeah.
straight to the readers. And
Yep.
and even like I was talking to Lois Master Bujold, who's a big sci-fi writer and has published, she's one of my favorites. She's published a lot of books, but she got her backlist online and has been selling it directly on Amazon, and has given her, she said in this, we had I went to the Nebulas, and she was Grand Master at this online convention, and she said it was the first time in her writing career that she's had a steady income that she could really count on for rent, you
It's
know,
amazing. Yeah.
and
Well,
this,
and I look at like, you look at like stuff like, it's highly stigmatized stuff like, male slash fiction,
mhm,
which has been in this kind of weird niche for a really long time now. And, so much derision cast at it. And yet it's a huge, huge thing, like self-published, um, Kindle, and Audible books. These writers are making a killing, and they're
mhm,
selling to. They make a very clear distinction between male and gay.
mhm,
So who's writing it and whose gaze it's meant for. The male is meant for that market, which is a very
mhm,
specific kind of market. And I think we talked briefly about kind of my opinions
mhm,
about who that might actually be versus how they're perceived. But regardless, they're making money. I mean, this stuff is. I mean,
mhm,
you look at the numbers. The stuff is really selling.
yeah,
Um, and I think that's actually kind of great. I think it's good, but I do think that, so meanwhile, it's these perceptions, we have these internalized perceptions of this stuff. And, and I think it's funny now because of the rise of the nerd, it's sort of like, you and I can do a reading with someone whose book became a major motion picture, and that shit was not happening when I mean,
yeah,
it did happen. It happened to like the Asimovs of the world. It
right,
didn't happen to just somebody I did a reading with and happens to be kind of in my generation and
right,
my sort of group of writers. And I think and certainly I remember Patrick Weeks, who we were in the online writing workshop with. Patrick went on to work at work on Mass Effect, and he's the one who got me into writing for games. And I think games opened up a huge amount of opportunity for creators to actually get paid what they were worth,
mhm,
because the games market is immense and it's lucrative and expanding. And unlike film, where films were made by maybe 30 or so people and then went out to millions, games are like made by a couple hundred people and then go out to millions. So it's super interesting to me, the whole thing about it. And now it's sort of like it's trendy. It's good to be, you say like I work in games and everyone sits up and pays attention and assumes you're hot stuff. But I mean, I've been writing this stuff since before it was cool,
it's,
and it's interesting, right? It's interesting, and
it
it's sort of like,
is.
yeah,
There's I don't know whether you saw this, there was an article going around that Hollywood screenwriter people are like, they are looking for diverse talent, and they're actually going to MFA programs and trying to find people there. They're like so short of writers,
wow,
uh, which is fascinating to me, right? Because having gone through an MFA program and a PhD program in creative writing, like back in the day, you finished the program and you were lucky if you published a short story after you
yeah,
finished, right? You certainly wouldn't be scooped up by Hollywood. And and if you were a poet, you never expected to make any
yeah,
money off of it. You hoped you got a teaching job to support yourself, right?
yeah.
So all right,
I mean,
I'm gonna drag us back. Unless, is there something else you wanted to? I was gonna.
no, I know just about the MFA thing, but we could talk for hours about that. I was going to say that,
Yeah, we got to
yeah,
do a follow-up episode about academia at some point, because that's
that,
its
oh, we
whole
should. That would
thing.
be
Yeah.
fun.
That
Talk
would,
about academia.
yeah,
That'd be
yeah.
fun.
We might have to censor a fair bit, but we'll go back. Darius can cut out all the stuff that we shouldn't say.
Wait, what
So
were we talking about?
we're going to talk about Fiberworld. We're going to talk
Oh
about
yeah,
how you ended up creating this thing. So what is it, right? So for
Fiberworld is an online yarn show.
yeah,
And I think the reason I got on that whole tangent was because when I tell people that, I do yarn and fiber stuff, or that I have a yarn company, um, I get reactions from people that are kind of like, oh, that's cute. And I know what they imagine, which is like, I sell yarn on Etsy, which has been true in the past.
sure.
And that crafting and everything is sort of for grannies or whatever. And I mean, I think perception about that is kind of tainting. But it's interesting. It's interesting how I'm not taken very seriously about it. And then I say something like, well, the biggest community that we have currently, which is, worth saying because this is also Fiberworld's community, the kind of numbers that we're talking about, there's 6 million plus users. I think that we're up to 7 million users on Ravelry.
Mm,
That is a not insignificant market, needless to say.
yeah.
Um,
Well, it's also, I think people, there's such a range of like price points in fiber, right? And
Yeah.
so I think if someone's only experience with yarn is maybe walking into a Michael's and getting
Right.
some, what is that one that feels so awful? I can't even, it's been so long since I bought it.
Yeah, well,
That,
like some of the Lion Brand acrylic yarn, or
yeah, right. Like that. I literally, like, I can't work with it because it makes me just miserable.
yeah.
The texture of it like hurts my hands, and so like if that's what, and it's very cheap,
Mm,
and some people are fine working with it. And if you are, the kind of knitter who is finding a lot of joy in making lots of shelter blankets, for
mm,
example, for all the little animals that need tough acrylic blankets, it's perfect for you, right?
right.
Like you don't want to spend a lot of money on luxury yarn. But I think people who are only familiar with that don't realize, I mean, I don't know what the most expensive yarns go for, but I've certainly spent, I don't know, $10 easily on handmade yarn, $20
Yeah,
for a skein, I want to
yeah,
say.
most of our yarn ranges from 26 to 38 a skein, and then
Yeah.
fibers like Kivia, the most expensive stuff can go up 50 or more depending on where it comes from and who's
Right.
processed it.
And
So
I'm really a dabbler, right? I'm not. There are people who do this much more seriously than I do and spend a lot of money on it.
they
And
do,
this
they
this
do.
is this is their main place where they put their disposable income, right? So
Right.
there's
And you go to these shows, and there's, we have the big shows that we do every year, the national shows. We travel to them. So there's a show up near you, Chicago. We do Stitches, for the yarn business. We go there, and Stitches is quite big. They have shows all over. They have one in California. They have one on the East Coast. They have one down south. They were going to hold one actually in New Orleans this year, which would have been great. We did one in Nashville with them. And every time we go to one of these conferences, we travel a lot of miles. We take our trailer with all of our yarn in it, um, and and it's a big conference. It's 5 days, usually 4 to 5 days. We set up. We're there all weekend, and hundreds, ranging to thousands of people come, and they buy a lot of stuff. And the numbers that we look at, for us, we'll make in the teens to the 20s for a show. Big companies will walk away from a show like that with about 150,000, 200,000, and that's just one weekend of sales. So these are not insignificant numbers we're talking about. So it's a big industry, and that's just one show. They're making money from their online sales. They're making, we're all making money. For those of us who wholesale, we're making money from selling to shops, and things like that. So I mean, it's our second income in this family. It's, comparable, probably actually makes more than my professor's salary if it
yeah,
came right down to it. And we reinvest a lot of the money back into the business again because it continues to grow. But if we decided to stace this out, I imagine the amount of money we're taking in would be,
yeah.
comparable.
I had an interesting conversation with Ben Rosenbaum, who I host another podcast with. We were talking, I don't know, a couple months ago, and about how he did programming as a backstop to his writing, right? That programming is what lets him be a writer,
Right.
and he can work 3 days a week as a programmer and have 2 days a week to write, and which makes total sense to me, right? But at this point in my career, 25 or so years in, I was like, I said somewhat casually to Ben, well, like when I'm writing, I'm making about $100 an hour writing. And he
Mhm.
said, what? And I was like, no, I think that's right. Like, and it's not like I can't write 8 hours a day. I can't,
Right, right,
like 5 days a week. Um, so it's more complicated than just like that's the math, right? And it's
right.
this salary. But I think it also, even though he's been in the field for 2 decades, just like me, um, it hadn't occurred to him to think of his writing like that as something,
Hmm.
and when I say that, and part of it is because he's mostly a fiction writer. I also do essays, and a lot of the essays are more reliable, like
Hmm.
nonfiction articles, reviews, etc., right? And but also some markets pay better.
Yeah.
I write for Wildcards with George R. R. Martin, and those stories I usually get paid $2,000 a story,
Right.
roughly, right? Plus royalties. So it's like it's a different ball game. Or when I'm doing writing consultation work for TV. I recently like looked over a script and did some development work for it, and it was, you know, a couple hours of work, and they paid me $1,200. So I think there is it's one of the things that I find frustrating about our field is that a lot of this is not transparent,
Yeah.
and people, you know, they hang out in a little group with their friends, people they meet at cons, and they maybe don't realize the range of what's out there, the other possibilities.
Uh-huh.
And you know, and that also applies for things like switching from traditional publishing to maybe doing something indie and being a hybrid writer. Of people are, if you're used to one model, you're like, oh well, I can make this much money with a story, and in
Mm-hmm.
fact maybe you would make 10 times as much if you were selling directly. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
not, you know, you have to be a marketer
Mm-hmm.
too, right? So
Yeah. I mean, no, I think that's a lot of it, but I think it's true. And I think there's this kind of scarcity mentality that happens with a lot of us. And, you know, we see it talking about Fiberworld, you know, it's sort of like, I wouldn't have done something, I wouldn't even attempted something like this 7 years ago when it wouldn't even occurred to me, right?
mhm.
You know, and I've had a successful fiber business now. I've been around the industry, I've seen how it works. And then I've started a couple of small businesses since then, and, you know, a nonprofit. And I've sort of watched my students also do some entrepreneurial stuff with their games and watched indie studios rise and fail and things like that. And just kind of, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about it. And I think that, we don't have conversations about how much money is where, and then how to go for the money in a way that's not dumb. You know, I think a lot of us came into writing, we're like, well, I'm going to sell a novel and make $1 million and it's going to be great. And it's just not how it works. Like, right. Like, you know, that's the like lightning strike moment, and that's great. And sure, great. If Hollywood approaches you, fabulous, go for it. But, you know, but the reality is that we're going to have to be our own marketers. And, you know, in the rare occasion that somebody's got our best interests at heart as far as our money goes, that's great, but that's not the norm. And again, like, you know, like I said, we see it in fiber. In the fiber industry, I think I've said before, is interesting because if a bunch of vendors and a bunch of instructors come, then they can put on a show. So you have your vendors, you have your instructors, you have all these things that attract your attendees to come, and they come to your show and they have a great time. And it's also a destination, and everybody makes money except the attendees, but they come, you know, they get a whole bunch out of it, right? You know,
Sure.
we're talking about like a vacation. This is like people plan all year to go to some of these shows.
Yeah.
Rhinebeck, which is the oldest, biggest, and most revenue-inducing show. I couldn't think of the right word, but anyway, in New York, you know, Rhinebeck is packed every year, and it's crazy. It's crazy what people make there. And even getting into Rhinebeck as a vendor is almost impossible. It's like Shangri-La. It's like, you know, well, someday we too might be at Rhinebeck, you know, and all the money, you know, and it's like, you know, and the streets are paved with gold there. But what, and then there's all these kind of like interesting equity things around all of this. Like you said, you know, who defaults to the arts, but then once you've defaulted to it, if you don't take it seriously, then it's not viable for you as a real business. And there's kind of a self-perpetuating thing there where you don't, because you're not in contact with other people who are making a good living at it, and then they're not passing that information on to you, how much they're making and what they're supposed to do. There's this real hush-hush thing at shows, you know, people are like, well, I don't want to talk about what I'm making. And it's sort of like, well, why not? You know, because then if like I, as a vendor, say like, Jesus Christ, how am I making $20,000 a show and you're only making 2,000 and you're not going to come again? Like, how can I, that affects all of us negatively. Yeah. And this person is not my competition. This person is another reason for attendees to come, right? So it's not like if I tell her how to do her business better so that she makes $5,000 the next show, it's not like that affects me negatively. It just doesn't.
You mentioned the scarcity mentality, and it's so easy for people to get into the mindset. I do think this is the default, right? Of like, oh, the pie is only so big, we're going to scrabble over the pieces of the pie. And,
right.
You know, in actuality, what we're trying to do is grow the pie and make a bigger pie, more pie for all. It's kind of funny because when you frame it that way, I do kind of like have this moment of catching myself and being like, "Whoo, I sound like a runaway capitalist right now," right? Because the flip side problem of this, right, is that yes, you can kind of like there, you probably can make more and more and more money than you ever thought you could, and we could
Yep.
all do that. And then uh, there's this sort of like moment of like, what is the cost to that?
Yeah.
Like
No,
what
I
did
mean, and
what,
that's right.
right?
Right. So
So
that's legitimate. Like that's legit. That's legitimate. Like we joke about the women who have, you know, whole rooms dedicated to their stash. And they say, well, I have a problem, and then I just keep buying it. And it's like, well, if a woman's just spent, you know, or a person's just spent $1,000 on yarn um, in my booth, and then she says, well, I have to hide this from my husband. It's sort of like, well, hang on a minute, is there a problem here? You
yeah.
know, like, am I like am I the bartender now? Do I need to cut you off? You
You
know?
know, I even have this, like right now I'm selling my cookbook, right? So A Feast of
Yeah.
Serendib, for those who are new, like I worked on it for years, it's a Sri Lankan cookbook. It's got great reviews, Publishers Weekly, blah, blah, blah. It was supposed to launch in March, and then coronavirus hit. And so it came out, but we had to cancel many months of book tour events. And honestly, for a couple months, I didn't even know what I wanted to do about that. I mean, we canceled, but then I was like, I didn't have the heart to promote it online because I think I was in shock a little bit, right?
Yeah.
As all of us were, and adjusting to this. So now I've started in like June, I started promoting it. We've uh, got some media interest, and people are buying it online, and we've started having sale events and so on. But the book is an expensive book. You know, it's
Mhm.
a big, beautiful coffee table book, and there's an ebook version and a paperback that's less expensive, but the hardcover is $40. And I have these like qualms, right? Of, you know, I thank God for libraries, because I hate the idea that someone might want my book and not be able to afford it, right?
Yeah.
I hate the idea that someone might spend more than they are comfortable spending on it, right? That they might actually, you know, spend enough that they're then in stress, um, for necessary expenses afterwards, right? And
Yeah.
so that's not my responsibility, and yet it's sort of all of our collective responsibility. I don't know if
It
that
is.
makes sense, right?
No, no, it 100% is. It 100% is. And I think that's part of where Fiberworld came from as well, was sort of this idea of like, okay, there's this massive symbiosis where we have this, you know, and we have it in publishing as well. You know, it's sort of like we would not have the industry if it weren't for the people who have rooms full of yarn or just buy two skeins of yarn. Regardless, they're the customers. That's, you know, that's how we make our living. And if we take care of them, they will take care of us. And if we take care of the other vendors, we all rise, you know. And if we take
Yeah.
care of the instructors, you know, and so forth. And in thinking about all of this, it's sort of like, okay, so, you know, like you said, like the virus was massive for the fiber industry because, of course, all the shows canceled right at the beginning of show season.
Right.
And, you know, the majority of us do the majority of our business at these shows. And we also pick up our wholesale very often at these shows. You know, the local yarn shops will sometimes come and look around the vendors and say, okay, these are the people I want to stock. And it's very common to be making those deals at these shows as well. So, you know, it sucks. And especially for new folks, it's really where they get known and get their stuff out there. So anyone who was just breaking into the industry in the last year or so this has been awful for them.
Right. And for if anyone listening here is not a textile person, I'll say, like, you know, when I think about this, I'm like, okay, some of the science fiction conventions have moved online really quite successfully,
Right.
but our our product is intangible. Is like,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
like and it's verbal, it's auditory, it's, you know, like some people can still do a reading on Zoom, and it's not the same as an in-person reading, but it's very close.
Right.
When I'm looking at yarn, part of it is the color,
Mhm.
which I can get most of the color off the screen, although even that is not quite accurate all the time. A lot of it is the feel of it, right? Like, I mean, a good yarn
Mhm.
store, you go in there and you are petting everything, right? You know, so like that's, I mean,
Yeah.
right now I can feel this, like, I'm like, oh, dang, I should have been like knitting all the way through this. Like now I want some yarn in my hands. So, you know, there's a comfort and a sensuousness, and I'm really interested to see how your vendors at this event I'm co-hosting will work to translate that to the virtual space, right?
Well, and yeah, so that's, I mean, that's kind of what we wanted to do was, you know, and it was cool. Like at the beginning of the whole, when everybody had to shelter in place quarantine, um, you know, people mobilized really fast. And the first thing that happened were these Facebook events where somebody would host a fiber festival for the weekend, in quotes, and they would invite a bunch of vendors, and then they would have a streaming show kind of like all weekend, you know, start of the day to the end of the day. And each vendor would get like an hour or a half hour or some amount of time, and they would have like, you know, we would have 100 Ravens hour, and we would show some stuff, and people could watch it in Facebook Live, and they could ask questions, and we could do a giveaway. And it was like Yarn TV basically for a whole, which I think is really cool and really smart, because yes, like yarn is so this, and remembering too that, you know, it's not all yarn. There's a lot of elements of this pattern.
Right.
It's all of the bits and pieces that go with it. Then, excuse me, there's a cross section between people who do, of course, all spinning, crocheting, all of the other weaving, the attendant arts, and then all these folks who do quilting and other sort of adjacent stuff that also finds its way into these shows.
But all the tools and gizmos, right? I mean, part of what I love about walking around Stitches is like, I think last time I was there, I bought a necklace that was like this beautiful brass pendant, but that you like a locket, but it held glass. It had like a glass panel with stitch markers, little brass stitch markers inside. And so it was this lovely piece of art that was also functional and super useful, and didn't advertise that you were a knitter, but for people who are in the know, they're like, oh, you're wearing stitch markers around your neck. That's cool. So
that's awesome. And I think that's it too, so that we it's that tipping the wink. It's sort of the, so, and that's moving towards kind of what we were talking about brands. So in thinking about like what these fiber shows are about, it's like, well, at their base level, we sell yarn to people to make things with, basically, and then a bunch of stuff kind of around that. But then it forced us to kind of think about like, hold on, what are the reasons that people are coming to these shows? Like, why does someone go to a yarn show? Well, yes, you know, to buy yarn, but they also go for the classes. Classes are a huge part of it. They go for the actual trip itself, and sometimes for the surrounding areas, although not usually. And then they go to hang out together. It's also, as with any con, it's a social thing, and it's an event. And we like events. We like to go, you know, I mean, we think about like, you know, human culture, like we go to a festival, we go to do a thing, we celebrate, we go together, we have rituals, you know, and this is like such a core part of like human dynamic. And I think especially in COVID, we've really missed that. All of those rituals of coming together, you know, Zoom is fine, but it's it ain't the same. So we kind of thought, like, in looking at this, I'm like, there's a lot that's missing, but one of the chief things that's missing is the interactivity. And as salespeople, we need that. Like, our customers will tolerate viewing us, but what they really want is the interaction. They want to be invited in, you know, hello, welcome to the shop, valued customer, how are you doing today? I mean, this is like time-honored ways of making sales, you know, and, you know, all the sales gurus will tell you that half of it's about making relationship, even if it's not a conscious relationship. It's, you know, part of brand is bringing someone in and making them feel like they identify, they're included. Like you said, tipping the wink to other knitters who look at you and say, that's a beautiful locket, but they're like, I know what you are, because I want those too, right? You know, and it's like, and it's this very same thing as if I wear a Nike swoosh, and then it's like, oh, well, I'm cool because I'm wearing this brand. And it's associated with things, you know, hopefully largely positive. And so thinking about all that, and then being a game designer, I was kind of like, well, okay, let's look at like the core experiences that make this pleasurable, and what are some opportunities that we have being online, because we can remove some of the barriers. And what we wound up with was a website that's a passworded website, and it is a physical location, a lot like our old MUDs, where when you go into the festival, it's going into the website, it's locked, you're like, you have a ticket, and then you're exclusive in that space that's just for you as a ticket holder. And then within that space, you can go and take classes. They're Zoom classes, but we have classrooms, which are web pages, and you can actually interact with the instructors. It's not all just passively watching. So they're going to do some instruction, but you can also show your screen and show what you're working on. and stuff like that. And then we have the marketplace, and the marketplace was our big thing. I really wanted, as a game developer, to look at like, how do we connect with people to make sales in a way that fits our model, which is that for us, for 100 Ravens, we're like, and I would even say like some of the very most successful brands, Madeline Tosh, Miss Babs Yarn. It is not about really the yarn. We all make beautiful yarn. It's about Babs herself as a person. It's about her brand. It's about the whole identity of Miss Babs. And she has everything from these sort of very Southern women who love beautiful colors and all of her flower colors to biker women. She has a whole line of colors that, you know, like for whatever reason, she's got a whole bunch of followers who are bikers. And I think it's freaking great. And for us at 100 Ravens, it's come in and we're going to be queer and trans and you're our pupil, and you know, and all of our yarns have like all of these hardcore geek references and literary references, and people go around and they're like, oh my god, it's Jack Harkness, I love him, oh hug the yarn, and then we all yell, I'll be in my bunk, right? And it's that's really it. That's what we miss, you know, and that's what we go to the festival for, to be like the same things we go to science fiction fantasy convention for, right? To affirm, these are my people, we hang out, we celebrate these things, we worship at the altars of, you know, Jack Harkness or, you know, or Madeline Tosh or whatever, and pay our tithes of thousands of dollars, you know, to get our picture taken or to our yarn home or whatever it is we're doing, right? Like you know, so we made individual web page booths for our vendors. So each vendor has their own web page. And on that web page, there is an embedded Zoom window. So users can go find their shop, and we have this really clever search engine. They can search shops by all kinds of things, but or including direct name. They go to the vendor's shop by going onto that web page. And once they go, quote unquote, into the shop, they can see a bunch of items. We have it kind of arranged like a booth on the web page. It's fun. It's, you know, very colorful, bright. So even though you don't get the tactile feeling, you have now entered a place. You have looked around and found all these beautiful things. And then the vendor themselves is there because they're waiting for you in the Zoom call when you come into the booth. So when the booth is open, basically. And that's whenever the vendor chooses to be there and have their open hours, but those hours are posted. So then the customer comes into the booth and says hello, and the vendor says hello. And then now we can talk about the product that's on the page. The vendor can also show things or do a screen share and show their website. And then all the items that are on our website just go straight through to the vendor's website. But it's basically that part of, I think, of selling that we've been missing, which is customer to vendor contact, and a chance to build that brand identity. And I'm really hoping that the vendors take advantage of all the different ways that they can do that, because it's an opportunity for them to think about ways to build an online audience outside of these very prescribed ways of like, I sell my goods on Etsy, I have a Facebook group, I do this, you know, and it's like, there's all these opportunities to connect with people online and have fun interactions. And that's really what sales is about, identity and fun, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, necessity doesn't enter into it here. Nobody needs yarn, really. You know, we're not in that phase anymore. This is all for funsies, you know? So that does raise a question of equity. So one of the things that we thought about is the fact of, okay, so what are the opportunities? When you bring something online, it automatically levels the field. And that's why we did it in a browser. Was we didn't want an app in the way. We didn't want anybody have to pay extra. People could be on a phone anywhere that got phone reception, go on the browser on the phone and have access to the website.
That was, I gotta say, that was fascinating to me about the nebulas, because they, because you did not have the travel cost of needing hotel rooms and flights. Lots of people who I ran into in the hang-in, they did a good job with making hangout spaces in a variety of ways. And so people I was chatting with, several people said they would not normally have come to this convention. It's too expensive, but having it virtual made it possible, including people from other countries, people from the other side of the world. And I thought that was fascinating. The internationalization that the virtual element is making possible is going to I mean, I hope coronavirus is over soon. I hope America gets its stuff together and we get this under control. Please wear your masks, people. But uh, I hope that after this is done, we carry the good parts of the virtual conventions
Yeah.
forward, right? And the
Well, and
virtual
all the lessons we've
spaces,
learned.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
all the lessons we've learned. I think
yeah.
so. And I think you're right. It's so the globalization is one thing. And as we were even before we had started this, we thought, oh, there's so much opportunity to make this a global yarn show.
Hmm.
And because it's like, and not only that, how fun would it be to have a 24-hour global yarn show where at certain hours of the day, there's a bunch of things going on, a bunch of Korean yarn people doing Korean yarn things in Korean. If you want to go over and like stay up all
Yeah,
night and then go watch the Korean content,
yeah,
you can do that and it's subtitles. How fun would that be to
yeah.
like
I
hang
had
out with that, you know? Like,
Yeah, I
like
had an idea for a rolling sci-fi convention that was like the 24-hour nonstop convention that would like
yeah,
start in like start on the East Coast and then no, sorry, start in California. I get the time zones mixed up. I have to think about which direction to go. But
yeah,
basically, like you'd have a set of con runners who would like hand it off every
yes,
2-3
yes,
hours to the next group. So like everyone picks up at like 9 o'clock their time. You know, you've
exactly.
got like one or two oceans to get over, which would wobble it a little bit, but you
Yeah,
can figure it out. Some people will start a
yeah.
little later, stay on a little early or whatever. But I think
Well, you know what?
that's
We can do that. We'll do that next. That's going to be our next thing.
cool.
Because I mean, this is basically what this is, right? And what
Yeah.
I didn't anticipate was I didn't have to reach out. One of the first instructors we had who applied to be a presenter is from Wales. And she's like,
Mm,
"Oh, I will show my Welsh studio." And I was like, "In seventh heaven." It's like, "Oh, she's from
that's
Wales. It's her
awesome,
studio.
right?
It's like my favorite place." Yeah. And we have a guy from Portugal who's Portuguese knitting. I'm
Yeah.
like who gets that? Like that's amazing, you know.
Yeah.
But then the other thing was that we had it gave me an opportunity to reach out to some folks that I knew who I know would never have conceived of teaching, and say, hey, I think you have the start of a brand here. You're doing something completely different. I'm talking about Lauren, who runs Mother of Pearl, and she is an amazing person, and just all of her stuff that she posts online just has this fantastic feel, and she's amazing. And she does these patterns she's always apologizing for. Well, I just kind of say, however you want to do it, you can do it. and and she apologizes for this, and I'm like, no, this is like Elizabeth Zimmerman. This was like her whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Don't apologize. Like, you have a thing here going about for yourself to experience this project that I'm giving you in the way that you want to experience it, and challenging people to step back from the pattern and have that creative experience. And yeah, you may have to teach them how to do that the first time. So why don't you teach a class about that? And she was like, I can do that. And I was like, yeah. You know, and this is a really good opportunity for someone like her because she's not incurring the costs of travel. You
Right.
know, she's going to just make the money for teaching free and clear. And I'm not, you know, everybody gets paid the same amount. I'm paying more than average, which I feel good about. And then we've been really aggressive about, you know, it's the fiber world is very wide.
Yeah.
And I've been really aggressive about bringing other voices and faces and people because they're there. It's not like they're not. There's like, you know, and they used to say to us like, well, women aren't writing science fiction. You know, like Chris
Yeah.
bullshit. These people are here. You know, everyone's here. You know, we're all here. We've been here.
Right.
You know,
Or like when Sherry Thomas did her anthology Dark Matter to kind of prove that Black people had been writing science fiction for 100 years, and people
yes,
didn't believe it until she was like, "I brought the receipts. Here are the stories. Here's Walter Mosley in 1920. Here's like boom,
yes,
boom, boom." And then
yes,
it's funny. I was like, I talked to big name editors in the field afterward who were like, that's like the first time that someone had like set out to prove something to them with an anthology there that had done it, and
yes.
they were very impressed, and it's very impressive. Dark Matter is a fabulous book, but it was just sort of a funny moment of um, I don't know, of people didn't believe it was there. It's like when
Right.
I not to make fun of my dad, but when I wrote Bodies in Motion, one of the stories has lesbians in Sri Lanka in the 1940s, and my dad heard me do a reading of this story, and he came up to me afterwards and he asked me, how did you do your research? Are you sure there were really lesbians in Sri Lanka? And I was like, yes, there are lesbians in Sri Lanka. I have met them.
Yes.
So it was this, like, it's amazing what is not evident to people, right?
Yeah.
And the sort of assumptions that we're all carrying around. I'll also point out, for the internationalization, another great piece of this is, due to the legacy of colonization and foreign exchange rates as a result, um, our money goes a lot farther when we're
Yeah.
paying someone in India or Africa
Yeah.
than in the US. And so it does feel a little bit like I'm fighting a blow for justice and against the
Yeah.
colonizers
Yes.
when we do that,
Yes.
right? So
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I feel that way, with this too, like every time we stuff like we bring on a student team and we pay them good wages, like good
yeah,
wages, not like,
yeah,
good for a student, it's like, well, no, like good wages. And yeah, I think one of the things that I've seen, and I know that this is the case in general, but for me as a business owner, manager, part of the reason I did this again was to level the field. And um, I I have found that for people who are in various groups, that you have to go out and get them twice. That it's, at
hmm,
first I was like, listen, I'm opening a door, come through it. And it's like, oh, hold on. And then I have to walk back through and say, hang on, over here, right?
yeah,
And that is not that anyone is deliberately missing opportunities or whatever, but it's that minimizing of one's own competence. It's being, you've been on the outside, somebody's told you you're not good enough, and you're sort of like, well, and there's this imposter syndrome and all this stuff. And we know, right? Like, I
hmm,
know from having been in games, you doubt yourself. You're like, well, could I really do this? Am I good enough? And it's like, well, yes, like you said, there's a million mediocre white people out there. Come on in, the water's fine. Like,
yeah. I mean, and not to. I always feel a little bad with that line because, of course, like, I don't know. They're many of them are not actually mediocre either, right?
oh
Like,
no,
they're
absolutely,
great at what they do,
absolutely.
but there is an unearned privilege to
Mm-hmm.
some groups,
Mm-hmm.
and assumptions that go with it. I saw this when I was running for office, right, or really before I ran for office, where Trump had been elected. Clinton had lost. We were, many of us on the liberal side were a little shell shocked. And we had a meetup of people who had been Hillary supporters. And I hosted it. I volunteered to host because we have the space and so on. And I said a few things, and afterwards, someone came up to me and she was like, "Hey, like, I volunteer with the local Democratic Party. I think you'd be a great person to run for office." And I said, "Oh no, I can't possibly." And she said, like, pretty literally, like, exactly that. And she was like, "Can I come and talk to you about it over coffee?" And I couldn't say no to that, right?
Right,
Because I'm
right,
polite. So, I was like, okay. But I like fully thought, like, no, there's no way I could do this, right? And
right,
then she
right.
comes and she like spends 45 minutes laying out for me why she thinks I should run. And at the end of it, I was like, maybe I should run. So,
Yes,
and then I went and
yes.
talked to my husband and he was like, sure, you should run. And I was like, oh, okay. And I ran for this very smallest of local offices, but did pretty well, and now I'm serving. And it's been um there's a whole lot of sort of research that shows that women have to be asked to run repeatedly
Yes, yes.
before they're willing to do it, and I think that
Yeah,
effect
it's the
gets
same phenomenon. It's the same
and
phenomenon.
and
Yeah,
it gets magnified for every additional
right.
marginalization you put in, right?
Yes,
So if
yes.
you were a queer disabled woman of color, then you've
You
got
got
to
to be
have
asked like 45 times with like skywriting and balloons,
exactly,
like the marching
exactly.
band.
No, and it's interesting, like, right now I'm on my I'm a professor in my day job, and I'm a member of the faculty senate as a faculty rep, and we have very few people of color in there. And literally, today's Friday, Wednesday, I was in a rep assembly meeting, and we're talking about doing anti-racist work, and with all of the Black Lives Matter stuff, how can we support the students? And this issue comes up yet again of we have almost no people of color in the faculty rep assembly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and I said, look, they're not going to come to you through the typical
Yep.
channels of like they volunteer for a committee, and then you know, like they're already probably overburdened 12 different ways. If
Yep.
you want them, we're going to have to seek them out, find out what it will take to make it possible for them to
Yep.
serve,
Yep.
right? And
Yeah.
that's a very different process. And you know, on the library board, we've been talking about that too, of like, you know, we can't pay an honorarium in the state of Illinois. We're not allowed by law to pay a stipend to library board trustees. So that means the only people who can serve are the people who can afford to serve, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you're a single mom with 2 kids, how are you going to come to the board meetings on a Tuesday night if you
Right.
can't afford to pay your childcare, right? So
Right. Right.
one thing that we finally managed to get through is, well, we already said we'd reimburse you for travel expenses related to your board service. We can reimburse for childcare too. So like that's a tiny little step towards equity.
Yep.
And no one's taken us up on it yet, but at least it's there and we can see
Right.
it, and maybe it means somebody will run who wouldn't have run before.
I mean,
So,
that's
I
it.
mean,
That's
you hit
it.
one of my push button things, so now I'm like off on this whole
No, no.
tangent,
But I mean, but this is a crux of it. This is a
yeah.
crux of it. And I do think that the online, the movement to online is a huge, huge equalizer in so many ways.
Mhm.
Um, and I mean, it is and it isn't. You know, we talking about the whole childcare thing and teachers and stuff like this. I was just talking to my colleague who runs the EMC at Champlain. She runs the whole shebang. You know, and she's got 2 young children, and her husband works, and you know, we talked about this before, but you know, the consciousness, regardless of how much her husband is doing, the consciousness for the family still falls to her. And on top of that, she manages an entire thing. You know, a high technology center. Um, you know how exhausting that is, and precludes her doing any other work that she might be doing. Um,
Yeah. I do have to say, I think some of it we do to ourselves as women,
yes,
right?
yes,
So I think,
yes,
you know,
100%. Because I told Sarah that too. I said, you know, like that there's this thing where it's like she believes that she's the only one who can do it right, you know, and that's part of it, or needing to please, and so always taking things on, or being unwilling to pass things off, either because you feel guilty or because you feel it won't be done properly, and it's just easier to do it
and
yourself.
sometimes it won't be done properly,
Right,
right? And
right.
it's
That's what she said. That's what Sarah said. Yeah.
and then there's a process of like coming to terms with that, right? Like so when I go, like I back in the good old days when we could fly to conferences, I would go to conferences basically once a month for work,
Right.
and either writing related, like a host of different things. And I did that a little less when my kids were babies, but even then I was going, you know, every few months. And I know a lot of women who basically didn't leave the house when they
Yeah.
were, you know, because they were
Yeah.
breastfeeding, et cetera, so on. And I was pumping. I'd leave bottles with Kevin and he'd take care of it. And I just went, and it honestly did not even quite occur to me not to go.
Right.
Like that part of the professionalism I had internalized, right? Like,
Which
of
is great.
course I'm going to keep going to my conferences. This is an
Right.
important part of my job, right? Like
Right.
you know, um, but there was a point when the kids were a little older and could report back to me what was happening when mommy was out of town, right? Where I had to come to terms with the fact that sometimes daddy took them, you know, up the street for dinner to the dinery place, and they had French fries, and that was
Yes.
their dinner, big bowls of French fries. And I was like, oh no, oh no. And then I was like, it's okay. It's
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
Once a month, a big bowl of French fries for dinner will not kill them. Once a
Exactly.
month, eating ice cream in our bed and falling asleep there, not going to kill them. It'll be
Exactly.
fine, right? He
Yep.
keeps them
Yep.
alive. That's the goal.
That's it.
Um,
If they're
and
alive at the
you
end of
know,
the day, our job is done.
that's right. And so, and of course, like there are things that I do that he also has to bite his tongue about, right?
Hmm.
In terms of
Hmm.
that he does not think are the best parenting moves ever.
Right.
So um, you evolve a little give and take there. But it's I think there is you know, we talk about decolonizing our language and so on, and often we're talking about this in race terms.
Hmm.
But I think the process of decolonizing gendered expectations, I don't know a better
Yeah.
way to frame that, is super hard. And it kind of hits you over and over. Like Kevin and I had this uh, sequence we had to go through about domestic labor and chores when we were just living together, where we kind of had to fight it out to get
Yeah.
to equity. And then we
Yeah.
did that. And then when we had kids, we had to do it all over again
Yeah.
because the biology made it harder and more complicated, and
Yep.
all the patriarchal assumptions kind of reared their ugly heads, and
Yep.
society was telling him all kinds of things. So
No, it's
yeah.
constantly negotiated, and I think that stuff is super powerful. And it's, it's, um, yeah, I think that that stuff is compelling, and I do, and just to kind of again keep circling back around. So talking about brands, so talking about how we value our work or don't value it, or whatever. So this idea that like women in the last however long have sort of woken up and said, okay, hold on, if I were doing this as a job, what would my job description be? And at first it was kind of laughing, but now it's like actually,
Yeah.
how much money would I be making out in the world for the things that I do,
Yeah.
and like which of my skills are specialist skills, like a lot to all of them, kind of thing. And talking about all that, and then realizing that there's so many things that we do that we should value and we should get paid well for.
Can I
Um,
ask you though?
yeah.
So I I find this super scary, right? I
Mm,
think this is kind of where I am right now, is when you say things like that, on the one hand, I'm kind of nodding along like, yes, I should, call myself executive director, and an executive director should make 70,000 to 100,000 or more a year, and
yeah.
that's what I should be planning for. And if I'm not doing that, then I should allocate more time to it and whatever, take
Yes.
it all seriously. But the stakes get raised when you professionalize in that way, right? If I say to Kevin, hey, I need you to take on more of the childcare because, yes, you make more money than I do right now at your math professor job than my English professor job, but there's a lot of potential for me to turn some of the things I'm doing into a big business.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's a good calculation for our family
Yes.
for you to take on more of the domestic labor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's scary because
Why? Tell me.
I'm asking,
I want to hear about that. I want to hear about that.
because I'm asking him to bet on me, right?
Yeah.
And to have confidence and faith that I have a good estimation of um, what the likely return is. Like, is this really something that people will love? If I'm trying to like take my curry powder and take it to a factory and get it manufactured, rather than right now it's all handmade at home and I sell it in small batches, right? If I tried to like get it into Whole Foods, that would be awesome, but it would require a big investment of family time, right? Somehow, right? It's not just my time, it's family time.
Yeah.
And uh, and I don't have a business degree. I think that's part of it. Like I feel like I've done so much of this by the seat of my pants, and I have great skills in certain aspects, right? In the actual, like I I think of myself as the talent, right? In that
Mhm.
sense, like,
Yeah.
right, but the talent needs a manager. And I'm like,
So let me talk to you, because there's so many things going on. There's so many things going on with that I don't even know where to start. So I have to give a huge shout out right now to the Vermont Center for Emerging Technologies, to Sam and Dave Bradbury there, who are all about entrepreneurs and startups, right?
yeah.
So everything you just said is super interesting to me, because I think I've said most of those things at one point or another, except maybe the domestic part of it. But because I didn't ask permission for
Mm,
dumping domestic things in Becca's lap, I just did it, right? That's
yeah.
that's privilege. That's that. Oh, I'm allowed to do a risky venture something, and whatever. So there's a whole bunch. I don't even know like where to start. So first of all, um, you feel that you have to somehow ensure that this venture succeeds, when the reality is that the majority of new businesses fail, and um, that is an accepted part of any venture. And so then
That's terrifying.
yes, 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 it is terrifying. And so that fear is something that it either can make it exhilarating, or it can make it something you don't want to do, right?
Mhm.
And at some point you have to step off and say, I'm willing to take this risk. And yeah, I think it does mean like, yes, you have to calculate, how much am I willing to gamble? It's like walking up to the craps table and saying like, hey, I can make some money at this, I'm going to go ahead and roll, I'm going to
Right.
influence the roll however I can. But the reality is, the majority of businesses fail, right? But first of all, you already have an established brand. It's not like you're starting new with a brand new product and you're going to have to need like, $1 million in investor equity to make this happen, right?
Yeah.
That's not the risk we're talking about. Like
Right.
when you lose at this, for example, or if you lose at this, I don't think you're going to lose at this, but if you lost at this, what is actually lost, right? And then to calculate that, it's not a big deal. Like for example, Rebecca sponsored / put some money and some allowing me to have time into doing Fiberworld. Now she's watched me do a couple of successful businesses now, so she knows, as far as the odds go, I haven't actually hardcore failed yet. I have had failure cycles within each business. That's expected, but overall, I've created two stable businesses and done quite well. They're not big, right? So I didn't take a whole bunch of money that somebody owned. Where it gets scary is when you take 2 years of your time and 2 years of everyone else's time, and you all don't work for any pay, and there's $500,000 to $1 million or investor money, and you lose it all, which happens all the time, multiple times, right? So you talk about the millionaire entrepreneurs will say, this is the business that they hit was a crapshoot. They couldn't have told you which of the 12 businesses they started was going to succeed. This is the one that made the money, right? And that's just how it works, right? And entrepreneurs think nothing of cycling through this process. It's like when we go to bake bread, we don't sweat the bread. We know that some bread will be okay and some bread will not. And as we get better at making bread, probably on average more than that. But there's always that chance that you're going to open the oven and it's going to be like, oh, what just happened, and you can control it to an extent, but not completely. So in terms of entrepreneurs, that truth is one. And then the other part of it is that nobody knows anything about anything, and that the people who start businesses don't need to be the people who know how to run the businesses, first of all. So you have an idea, right, to do this thing. You have the brand, you have your clout, you already have a following, right?
Yeah.
And brands these days are made up of very different things than they used to be, because you come with a whole bunch of people on board with you, which is very new, right? Like you have a customer base that far exceeds what a normal customer base would have been however many years ago, that where you only had the reach of the people in your neighborhood or whatever. But you have a brand already that has several hundred customers or potential customers.
Yeah.
With it, right? And you're bringing that along with you. So that's already established. And in terms of businesses, I think that is the hardest part of it, is that connection.
I think, it's interesting. I think this should have been obvious to me, but, I just did my taxes a couple days ago. And in that process, I had to come to terms with the fact that last year we bet on the business, took a $30,000 loss. This year we did as well, all of which was planned. And, I have close to 2,000 books sitting in a warehouse. If those all sell, we will make 80,000, it's so hopefully they all sell. And if they don't, we didn't bet more than we can afford. I have a friend who started a local bagel shop, the Daily Bagel, Amanda Daly. They're incredibly good. If you're in the Oak Park area, highly recommend it. She launched it in the middle of coronavirus, which is horrible. And she has had a magnitude larger of risk involved in opening a brick and mortar store, right? And all the equipment she had to put in, redoing the kitchen, et cetera, so on, right? So, I don't know the intricacies of finances, but I think often people will mortgage their homes, and we didn't do anything like that. We didn't make that big a bet, but I'm starting to think, I made a big enough bet. Maybe I should have spent some of the money, or maybe now is the time to spend some of the money on bringing in a business manager person of some kind, right?
So that was going to be the next thing that I was going to say. So that the biggest thing that I learned from Sam and Dave Bradbury and all those folks, and I think this is so important. I can't even tell you how important this is. And talk to anybody who's starting a new business or getting involved in business, that the two biggest pieces of advice I have are to remember that for the majority of businesses, it's not actually about your product, it's about your connections, which is why I know, Mary Anne, that you will be successful. It's why you were immediately a good politician, and it's why immediately you're going to be good at being essentially a beautiful hybrid of an influencer and this lifestyle brand. and having product, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you will do well at that. I once all the pieces come together and there's an actual roadmap in place. But yes, what I learned was I'm super good at being an entrepreneur. I come up with great ideas. I'm very good at getting very talented groups of people together. And then the best thing I can do once I've done that is get away from it. I say, here's my priorities, here's what I want done. And then I just step back and I say, tell me where to show up and what to do. And then I do those things. And then I work on maintaining the connections, which is the other thing I'm great at is selling stuff. And by selling stuff, I mean making connections, not actually selling stuff.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, I should say for people who are listening, I've been trying to hire help in the last couple of years. Our video recorder here, Darius Finisar, has been fabulous at
Yay, Darius.
becoming a showrunner for us and editing videos. He's a former intern and student of mine who's doing terrific. But I have various part-time assistants for both my writing business, Small Press, and for the nonprofit I run. But I feel like maybe what I need is a business partner or something, like someone who has business skills already and knows how to do, like I've hired a bookkeeper to keep the books, but that's not the same thing as being able to look at how much money is coming in, how much is going out, and what should we bet on next? Where should we invest things, right?
And things like business plans and things like that. Although I think, so there's another thing. So this is the other thing I wanted to address, though, is that I think that especially for small business people, I hear this a lot of people kind of putting the cart before the horse when it comes to business of like, I need to, there's this guy I was arguing with online the other day, as I do argue with people online, but he wants to make a VR game and sell it. And he's never made a game before, and he doesn't have a company. So the first thing he said he's going to do is make a company. He has to get enough money. He's in Europe somewhere. Get enough money to create a legal company so he can get the licenses for all his software. And I'm like, that is completely ass backwards.
Yeah.
Like, the first thing you need to do is make your game. You're going to make a really good demo of your game. And you're going to see if people like it. And you're going to attract people to it and say, you should play this. What do you think of this? And then see if it's as good as he thinks it is. And then you should go, and you've been to, and so my point is.
No, I agree. But I would just want to highlight, I think that problem comes out of the scarcity mindset too.
Yes.
I see this with my students a lot. They're like, I have one idea for a novel. I must protect it, right?
Yes.
And, as you go on in the field, eventually you realize you're going to end up with way more good ideas than you will ever have time to implement, right? So that's the problem you think you have at age 20 is not the problem you're going to have even in 10 years, much less 20 years. And so go ahead. It's probably not $1 million idea, that first idea of yours. Don't be worried about blowing it. Just go ahead and do it, and you'll be.
So I would say that. So I would also say that to people about businesses, because it's exactly the same, right? Like, I started a yarn business and it was a good idea and I knew it was going to work because there's a model. Like, the model's all around me. It's not new, right? This whole business of Fiberworld, I mean, I'll be able to tell you in a month and a half if it was actually a good idea. I don't know right now. Like, the signs say maybe something good. It's looking okay, but I won't know until I have the receipt. Until the attendance has happened and it's gotten good reviews and people are happy and we're setting up to do it again next year. I won't know. And so it's a gamble, but I had a very small amount of investment money to play with. And I was told, play with this. And I had the time over the summer. And then I assembled my student grade. And that's the other thing too. I think the ability to know, like what you were talking about, it's knowing like, okay, you have an accountant and they're going to help you handle the money. And you have a really good product and you have a really good brand and you have a really good idea of like this kind of like plate of things, but like arranging the plate and then presenting it to the right people, or the plates and presenting those to the right people, is what's really key about this whole process, figuring out who your audience is and what they want, and then being like, would you like this, and sometimes you got to go to them first, and say like, what do you want, and I did that too with Fiberworld. I did a whole survey process before I even started to make sure I was on the right track.
No, I know people like my stuff. Sorry, this is turning into a therapy session, guys. But I think that it's like a business therapy session.
Yeah.
So, but I guess the other piece of it is that like the dream seems very big, right? So if you ask me, you know, you've been telling me I have a brand for a while. I'm not used to thinking of it in those terms. I have other, you know, I have one friend who for a decade has been calling me the Sri Lankan Martha Stewart,
Yes.
and
And I
telling
think that's your brand,
and
basically. Yeah.
telling me and telling me I should have a TV show and all this stuff. And I used to laugh at him, and now I'm like, no, maybe I should have a TV show. But it's,
Right.
I mean, but that
Right.
sounds huge, you know. Or like when I walk through Target and I see the Magnolia line, I
Hmm.
think that's the name of it. They had a magazine first, I think, and now there's a line of home goods in Target. That's not just a line; it's like a big chunk of the store, and it's beautiful stuff. I've bought many things out of that line. I really like it. It's not quite my aesthetic, it's more farmhouse, but there's enough overlap with the stuff that I do love that
Right.
I buy some pieces and incorporate them. And so like, yes, I could imagine a Serendib line at Target. I would love that. But that
Yes.
sounds, I mean, that sounds like
Well,
I don't
so
know,
it's
like
like,
suddenly, so now I sound like the kids who were saying like, oh yeah, my
no, no,
novel
no,
is
no,
going
no.
to sell a million
But
copies, right?
but
You
here, but
know?
there's no, no, no. Hold on, because there's a huge difference. The first difference is this: you have done the work already. You actually have a product, right? Your products are there. Your core product is your risk piece. Your
Hmm.
core product is your design sense. So you have all these entities that are not working for you yet. The design sense of your house
Right.
is a product, right?
Right.
And it is loved. And your ability to create a welcoming space within your home. And we're talking about the idea of like lifestyle and how it's expanding. And as I'm presenting it as part of Fiberworld is to include justice, to include our own education and development and our own
Hmm.
caretaking, but not in kind of the weird sort of sexist way of like, oh, women can only think of self-care in terms of like a bubble bath, right?
Yeah.
That's like the height of self-care for a woman, where it's like, hold on, like maybe your self-care is no, once a month I go to these conferences,
Right.
and that's because my professional development is probably the most important thing to me, or whatever, right? Like, so
Right.
and for me, my self-care is making sure I'm always making something or starting new businesses. It's like that's what I do. That is actually my self-care. That's how I, like, as a human being, that's how I function. And figuring out ways to shape my life so that I always have room for that, like as you have, I think is really important. So, when you talk about like, so you have this brand, you have done all that work. So now you've got this product, you have this knowledge of navigating this space to sort of, like I said, reconciling the idea of a beautiful domesticity that is not anti-feminist, that is also part of carrying on really important cultural traditions without carrying some of the baggage of those traditions. Like, how do you incorporate the best parts of feminism, that are the best parts of domesticity, the best parts of a cultural heritage, or the best part of, whatever else, these hearth and home ideas, but at the same time, bring them up to date and make
Yeah.
them work for you and not against you as a person,
And
and
and to be clear, like I don't know that have the answers to all of that, but I'm super interested in the questions, right? Which
exactly,
is
and that's it.
hosting the conversation. Like this is why we've been talking about like maybe we need to do yet another magazine. It'll be
Yes,
my fourth magazine, but but that a magazine slash podcast slash video series, who knows what it's gonna look like.
right.
But that I've been kind of talking about is like Martha Stewart meets Granta, right? Where we
Yes,
bring the literary essay world to meet the domestic sphere and all
right.
the arts involved
And
there,
sometimes,
right?
and it's kind of like what we're doing with this podcast. I think
Yeah,
that a lot of people, again, they get ahead of themselves. It's like, well, what's the market? What are we going to give to people? It's like, whoa, 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 back up. What have you got?
yeah,
Right? Because right now we're doing this neat podcast. We don't know what it is yet, but we know that we're enjoying making it, and these conversations probably have value to other people. So the idea is that now we have this product, we're pretty sure it has value. How do we find the people who would like to have some? And then
right.
how do we, right? And then, like, how do we package it? Because it's like, when you make your, beautiful mango fluff, and I watched that video, that was like the best video, I loved it. But like, there's so many parts of product in that. You have the actual product, which is, I'm going to go sell these mango fluffs somewhere, and people are going to buy them because they're beautiful and tasty and fabulous, and they can't get them normally, and nobody will have eaten anything like that before, and it will be fantastic and appeal to people. That's one product, right? And
Hmm.
then there's the product of the recipe so people could also make these fabulous things at home. And the fact that you're entering people's kitchens with your recipe, which is, to me, it's really intimate. You know, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
here's the way I do it at my home. And I find that really interesting. When I do a recipe, I always feel like I'm connected to the person who created the recipe, you know.
Yeah.
And these recipes have stories. They're handed down from here to here. Oh, somebody gave me this recipe, but I hated this because it blew up, so I did this thing, you know.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, there's the actual video itself and the product of that video, which is a how-to video. So it has that value, but it's also, we watch it to see inside your house. So I've been thinking more about influencers recently, because I haven't quite understood that whole phenomenon. And I just have been watching a thing that's got me thinking about it more and understanding it a little bit better. But the idea that, like, you are a person out in the world that people feel an affinity to and for and would like to go along with,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what you do, they want to do and have. And so if you wear a fabulous stitch marker necklace, they want to wear it,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's cool. Mary Anne wears that, you know, and she has a beautiful house, and we want to be like her. And Mary Anne also recognizes that, like, this facade is often a facade, and that, you know,
Yeah.
even as the home is beautiful and we have this beautiful garden, these beautiful flowers, you know, there are moments where we throw ourselves down on the divan and sob uncontrollably, you know.
Right.
And that's part of that house, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that that's another thing, the honesty about that, you know. And that's what
I did, by the way, clear a big stack of papers off that chair before we started this Zoom conference. So,
right.
you know, so it's right here next to me. I could like pick it. Look, here's it'll go everywhere. Here's the big stack of papers, right? That needs to be sorted. So, you
Right.
know,
Yeah. So I think, and I think that having that product, then really all that's left is to kind of sort it all out, figure out what people would like, how to package it. Some people get this, some people get this. They can order what they want, you know, like, and that's how we do it. And we'll find our customers, they'll come to it, and then word of mouth, and then our marketing and things like that. And I'm just sort of starting to learn about marketing. I'm really bad at it. So that's something I need to do too, is hire people who really do know about marketing. But I want them to understand, though, that in terms of marketing, our type of marketing is different. You come with your own audience, and I think, like I said, it's much more like influencers. It's a hybrid of a couple of different ideas. But for yarn, we have our customers. We come with them. You know,
yeah.
they come along with us. So
I think
every vendor at Fiberworld is bringing their customers. You know.
one of the things I've been doing this summer is, you know, so since I had a cookbook come out, I thought I should, you know, maybe I should try writing some food essays, place them in magazines. And so I subscribed last year to a whole host of magazines: Bon Appetit, Food and Wine, Milk Street, Good Housekeeping, many of which I'd read an issue or two of before, but now I subscribed and I'm reading lots of them. And when we think about brand, one of the things that I've been thinking about it, it's also going to help shape this magazine I'm hoping to create, because they take such different approaches, right?
Mm-hmm.
So some of them are aimed towards a high-end, expensive market, people with money who want the best tool, who want the best hand-roasted bean, whatever it is, right? Some of them have, you know, Good Housekeeping, I think, is often more geared towards, like, here's this great dish, here's a recipe for it, here's how you can do it on a budget, here's how you can do it quickly on a weeknight, you know.
Right.
Milk Street, which is the America's Test Kitchen, geeky,
Yeah.
like, we've made this 300 times and this is why it worked, blah blah blah, which I love. I mean, like,
Yeah.
that one's probably the closest to my mindset, like Alton Brown, of like, I'm gonna get sciencey about my food, right? And like,
Yeah.
I will know exactly why this is browned correctly. And at one point I was trying to make vegan marshmallows a couple of years ago, and I was making them over and over and over, and, you know, change the proportions over and over, trying to get them to set. It's a very hard problem. And Kevin came in at one point where I was almost in tears because I'd messed up a batch, and he was like, you know, you don't have to solve the vegan marshmallow problem, right? And I was like, I'd gotten caught up in it, and I was like, this is what I'm doing this summer. And I'm like, all right, I put it aside. But sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent. But
That was
the
good. It's good.
but the I think when we're thinking about brands and we're thinking about audience and who it is we're talking to and what it is we want to do for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe I have a little trouble with the idea of an influencer in the sense of like, here's somebody who like I'm not so interested in people trying to become copies of me, but what I am interested in is if there's something I'm doing that makes my life easier, brighter, more beautiful, that has like a technique, a lesson, or whatever, a tip that they can take away and apply themselves, that will make their life easier, brighter, more beautiful. I love that. I mean, that's the thing that really gets me. Like this, it's in fact why I kind of love Target, because I feel like when Target came on the scene, they made beautiful design much more accessible to people at an affordable price point than had been true before. IKEA does some of the same stuff. It's a different aesthetic.
Yeah.
And that really appeals to me, you know,
Yeah.
like as much as
Yeah.
I love walking into the luxury tile stores, but when we were redoing our house, I went to the merchandise mart. I walked into a luxury tile store. My contractor said, well, just go look just to get an idea of like what you like and so on. You know we've budgeted for the $3 square foot, Home Depot tile. But take a look. And I went in, I went to this tile store, and I'm wearing like jeans and a t-shirt. I look ratty, whatever. After a while, this lady comes up to me, and clearly she's like, so what do you like? And she's polite, right? And I was like, and I pointed to the one that I liked the best. And she had this look of like such sympathy on her face, because she's like, she knew I couldn't afford it. She could tell, right? And she's like, oh, honey, that's $300 a square foot. It's the most expensive tile in the store. You have excellent taste, And I was like, well, all right, good to know, right? And there's that whole phrase like champagne tastes on a beer budget, which my
Yeah.
contractor used a lot as we were going through that process of doing the home renovation. But we found compromises. We found the Home Depot tile that I could afford, that had the look, the elegance, the grace, the beauty that echoed what the $300 square foot tile was at. And I think that, I don't know, that really interests me.
So I want to challenge something you just said,
Go
because
for it.
I get it. I get what you're saying, but at its root, I don't agree with it. So
Okay.
you said to me just now, I don't want to be the person that people are like, I have to be like Mary Anne. But hold on. I'm gonna challenge that for a minute.
Okay.
Because as a video game designer, someone who teaches video game design, right? Like the whole point of telling stories is to show human beings themselves in various reflections, and a lot of those reflections are aspirational, and some of them are reachable, and some are not. And I would argue that the best storytellers show their heroes in such a way that they are recognizable and achievable. And in some ways, all you have to do to find that hero is to look inward. And that's part of the appeal to me of, say, a Stephen King, or I don't know, your characters, is that these are folks whose moments of heroism are small and real and attainable. And so if there's a whole lot of different reasons to watch, like for instance, I'm going to use as a good example, I'm going to use the new Queer Eye.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So why do we watch Queer Eye? We watch Queer Eye because we want to watch people go through a transformation, because at the beginning of the transformation, they are like us. They are the every person. They are, potentially unfortunate looking, or whatever. And they're treated kindly in this version of the show, which I appreciate. But it's clear that they want to change. They want to have this transformation. And in this case, it's sort of an aesthetic transformation, but it also isn't, because the beauty of what the five are doing is that they're bringing in this person through a change from the current state, which is in some ways dysfunctional, into a more like a state that realizes their truer, better interior self, right? Not that who they are isn't good, but they have potentialities that haven't been reached, and they're helping free those up. And then that's sort of reflected on the outside. And I think that's really nice. Like, I really like that. And that a lot of it's about confidence and things like that. And I think that the idea of an influencer at its core is that like if we look at someone like Tan, or we look at any of the boys, and Jonathan, um,
Hmm.
so that's part of it, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that Jonathan, just recently came out as non-binary, I was like, oh fuck, thank you,
Hmm.
right? Because I look at them on the show and I'm like, oh, Jonathan, like how beautiful you are for being so utterly yourself with your beautiful
Hmm.
beard and your gorgeous skirts and your
Yeah.
swishiness, but also your height and all of these things that
Yeah.
is Jonathan. And aspirationally, I can look at what they have done and said, oh, I could be that person. I could be that person who would be so careful about their appearance and yet uncaring about anything other than feeling beautiful in what they are wearing that day, and not getting hung up in what I often get hung up in, which will, how can I have a beard and then breasts at the same time, and then be really uncomfortable with that and feel like, ugh, people are going to hate this and it's going to be gross. And yet there's Jonathan on the screen saying like, no, I am going to, throw myself into the arms of firefighters, and this is all going to be fine.
Oh, that was a great moment.
Yes, yes, and they were so sweet
Yeah.
about it, and he was, and they were so accepted, and I was just like, oh, that's me, right? So when you present yourself as, instead of this is why we like Julia Child too, right? Like,
Hmm.
it was aspirational in terms of her cooking, but anyone could be her.
I
She
think
wasn't
what's
perfect.
okay, so but
You
it's
know?
not. So I think when you say anyone could be her, I think that's the framing. I'm not disagreeing with you. I
Yeah.
think it's not that I want to be her. It's that she shows me how to be my more authentic self. And I
Yes.
like
Yes.
that's
But
what we
that's
want, right? Like
right. Right.
that's like the best influencers.
Yes.
That's what they do. I mean, even
Yes.
like running for office,
Yes.
Obama said pick up a clipboard, and that gave me the confidence to
Yes.
pick up a clipboard, right? So,
Exactly.
right.
Exactly. But I think that that's really important. And so when we talk about, we talk about selling our identities or selling our brand, I think that that's the critical part of it. Like I am personally brandless, right? Like it's not, but you have a brand already. You have that. And like I
I
said,
do
that's not
kind of,
something you're
yeah.
gonna have to, yeah, you do 100%. And you have a following with that brand. And so now you've already got that power. You've already got the start of that momentum. All you have to do is mobilize it, leverage it, and grow it,
Yeah.
right? And that you're in a unique position because of that. You have spent years building your brand
Yeah.
and building your community, and also all of your skills about how to talk to people, and all of your skills about how to write. And so you make this beautiful cookbook, and you know what to put in it because you're freaking editor, for God's sake. This was not like some, outlandish leap for you. It was a completely
Right.
normal thing for you to do, was to build this. And so now the next part, like you said, is to find someone who can help you talk through what you're going to put on what plates at first and how you're going to serve them out into the public. But I also wouldn't overthink that too much, because you may have to try a few times. Like, would you
Yeah.
like this? No. What about this? Would you like this? Oh, no. Oh, you really like this thing. Let's do more of that.
Well, and I'll add one more piece for anyone else listening. I think a key element to all of this is figuring out what you do that you can sustain and
Yes.
take joy in doing,
Yes.
because like I like at the start of the summer, I did a cooking class with Pooja Makajani, and I love Pooja. She is a great food writer. She's a great food photographer. I took a writing class with her about food writing. She is terrific on many fronts, and um, and like I model myself after her in some ways. And so I did this cooking class with her where she was teaching us how to bake star bread, and it was awesome, and I did it, and she answered questions. She limited it to 20 people, so it felt very intimate, and you really could during the rising phase there was a lot of time to ask her questions, right? We all kind of went away, but then we could come back, and the and so at the end of all of that, I was like, yeah, I should do the same thing. I should have like cooking classes online, and be running those every week. And I made an ambitious schedule. And then like I set up the first one, um, and nobody signed up, but I also like didn't really promote it. And there was sort of this moment of like, I don't know that I even want to do this, right? Like I I'm finding it, I've been doing so much Zooming and recording of podcasts and whatever else, like I think I'd hit my limit. And adding in a whole host of new cooking classes on top of that was too much, right? And
Mhm.
you know, and this is true for social media work. Like I'm good at Facebook, I'm getting better at Twitter, I'm terrible Instagram, and I have hired someone to help with that.
Yeah, yeah.
Like because it's and as a food writer, you got to do Instagram, but I just don't hang out there, right? And so, and time is limited, so you
Yep,
have to kind of like go back to you can try all these different
yep,
things, but then you've got to figure out like which are the ones that feed me, that bring me joy, that I
yes,
can keep doing,
yep,
and sustain and not be drained at the end of the day, right?
right.
So
And you never know too, because I mean, that's the other thing. Like, you put something out once, it took years to get the yarn business really rolling, right? That took
right,
time, and people had a market. I knew I like it was not rocket science, right? But it does that takes time.
yeah.
Some stuff doesn't. And so some stuff you're going to do in the meantime, well, whatever it is that you kind of wanted to do that you didn't quite have the audience for yet. But I mean, come on, if you actually taught it to, we can make that happen, right? And for that matter, please, by all means, bring that one class to Fiberworld,
Oh
teach
yeah,
it.
yeah. Well, and in fact,
25 people will show up for
uh,
it.
feel free to put that on the schedule. I did do one for the Skokie Public Library, and that was great. Like they organized it, they had an audience that they already could tap, and
Right.
I didn't have to market it. I just had to show up and teach, and
I
that
love
was
that.
great, right?
Yeah.
So
I know people bring me in to talk, and I'm like, that's awesome. There's like
yeah,
people, and all I have to do is like wind me up. Like, I was going to do that anyway. So great.
that's
Cool.
right. That's right.
You can put my name
So
on a poster. Yes.
all right. Well, we're almost at the end of our scheduled time. At any rate, we could talk about this forever.
Yeah.
Um, so, all right. Well, so I think we're gonna try and get this edited and out fast. Is
Cool.
my thought is that we should just put it out now, even though the rest of the series isn't ready yet.
Yeah,
So,
why not?
because we want people to know about Fiberworld, I'm going to be one of
Mm-hmm.
the co-hosts, along with Franklin Habit is one of the co-hosts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who is a
Yep.
fabulous designer. His work is so beautiful. I'm really excited to get to talk to him. I hope I get to talk to him.
You will.
So,
You
and
will.
then
You're going to talk to him. Yep.
yes, and the other co-host,
Is Nisinama Diode, and he's incredible. He does couture, and
mm,
he's had his own Fashion Week show. He's amazing. Yeah, so he's gonna be there too. So, and
awesome.
he does a whole bunch of other stuff. So
Well, that's great. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to Fiberworld. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So, and hopefully fun for everyone who's attending. And we're making a new thing, right? Which is very
yes,
cool. Very,
yes.
very cool. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody for listening. I hope
Thank
if there's
you.
any small business entrepreneurial people out there that this was helpful,
Yeah,
even if it's just in like the whole processing of fears and working through all of this. So,
yeah, for sure.
yeah, dream big.
Nice. Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks, Kel.